Hello and welcome. We have a large number of people joining us today. We're just giving you a moment to get started. Terrific. Well, thank you everyone who's able to join us today. My name is Katharine Lusk. I serve as the co-director of the Boston University Initiative on Cities. I have a very simple task today, so you won't see much of me. I'm really just here to say thank you for joining us, for getting to yes on housing in Greater Boston and Framingham. We are always delighted to have an excuse to welcome Mayor Spicer to campus, whether it's virtually or physically, and always happy to have an excuse to feature the great work of Professor Katie Einstein, who is a fellow with the Initiative on Cities. That is all I have to say today. I just want to say thank you to Abundant Housing Massachusetts and thank you to CHAPA for putting on this terrific event and inviting us to be a part of it. We're happy to provide the stage for all of you for today's conversation. Lastly, I'm going to turn it over to Yvonne Jimenez, who I will also add, I heard today was the newly named president of the board of directors with Abundant Housing Massachusetts. Yasmin, over to you.
Thank you, Katharine. You made me blush, so thank you for that. We're really excited to have everyone here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope each of you are tuning in, feeling safe and healthy. My name is Bella Jimenez, and I'm the board president of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. I'm excited to welcome you all and thank you to the Boston University's Initiative on Cities. I'm a proud alum of BU and their graduate planning program, so it brings me much joy to be able to work on bringing this discussion today on how to create more housing opportunities in Greater Boston and Framingham. Before we begin, I want to tell you a little bit more about Abundant Housing Massachusetts. Abundant Housing is a newly formed statewide organization working on pro-housing solutions across our Commonwealth. Massachusetts has a severe housing problem. We're not building enough homes to keep pace with demand, especially homes that are near jobs and public transit. At the same time, we're seeing the continued legacy of racist, classist, and segregationist policies, which have kept communities of color locked out of opportunity and locked out of homes. Our message is simple. We want abundant housing for all. We believe in a housing market that lets people move when they want, where they want, not when they have to. We believe in communities that are empowered and economically diverse, and we aim to find positive pro-housing solutions that bring equity to the center. This work is personal for all of us. So we invite you today to listen, to engage in the conversation, and you can learn more about our work and become a member by visiting abundanthousingmass.org. Now, I'm pleased to welcome today's speakers. First of all, we have Dr. Mayor Yvonne Spicer. Thank you so much for being with us today. She is the first mayor of the city of Framingham, which is such a fantastic note to add. She was sworn in to office on January 1st, 2018, the same day Framingham officially became a city. She was previously the vice president for advocacy and educational partnerships at Boston's Museum of Science. And while there, Mayor Spicer was known for building partnerships in STEM, education, policymakers, school districts, and other stakeholders. Prior to that role, she was an administrator in both the Framingham and Newton public schools after beginning her career as a teacher in Framingham. She is committed to sustainable economic growth, and she has served on the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, the Mass Office of the Treasurer's Economic Empowerment Trust Fund, and on the Standing Committee on Ways and Means. She earned her doctorate in educational leadership at UMass Boston. Welcome, Mayor Spicer. Thank you so much for being here. I'm also pleased to introduce Whitney Demetrius. Hi, Whitney. I'm so happy that you can join us. She will be moderating our conversation today. She is the Director of Fair Housing Engagement at Citizens Housing and Planning Association. And in her work, she seeks to change the local conversation by empowering those most impacted by a lack of affordable housing, elevating pro-housing voices above the noise of opponents, something we'll hear today. And she also helps set the stage for diverse and sustainable local coalitions by identifying barriers to fair housing. Knowing that affordable housing reduces health inequities, stabilizes our communities, is why she is so committed to this work. And I've seen that firsthand. So thank you, Whitney, for your work and your leadership. Finally, but certainly not least, is Dr. Katharine Levine Einstein. She is an associate professor of political science at Boston University, faculty fellow at the Initiative on Cities, one of our hosts for today, and assistant director at the newly formed policy of Center for Anti-Racist Research. She studies inequality in local politics and housing policy, and she is one of the authors of Neighborhood Defenders, Participatory Politics in America's Housing Crisis. We will hear today from her great important research, which will help set the foundation for today's discussion. Thank you so much. We will have time for questions, so please make sure to engage in the chat and in our Q&A, and I'll turn it over to you, Whitney, for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Bea. It is really, really a pleasure to be here with you all today. And amongst such esteemed panelists, I'm certainly privileged to be part of this conversation and to be moderating it nonetheless. I did want to allow an opportunity for Professor Einstein to center us, right, in our conversation around some of the research that she has done. So I'd love to be able to turn it over to you, Dr. Einstein, to sort of center us in the work and then have us jump right into the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to Abundant Housing and the Initiative on Cities and these amazing panelists for putting together this phenomenal event. I'm so excited to get to share this work here. So I'm going to share my screen here, which hopefully worked, and go full screen. All right. So one of the things that I want to talk about for today is to get us a state of sort of where we are in participation in housing politics in 2021. And so I know many of the people in this virtual room probably know some of the research that my co-authors, David Glick and Max Palmer and I did a few years ago, where we dug deep to better understand participatory inequalities in planning and zoning board meetings across 97 cities and towns in Massachusetts. And what we uncovered were perhaps not surprising to anyone who's actually been to one of these meetings, but really distressing and sizable inequalities, with these forums really biased in favor of white people who are over the age of 50, and homeowners. And moreover, the folks who showed up to these hearings are overwhelmingly opposed to the construction of new housing. These are folks, only 14% of commenters showed up in support of new housing. And these patterns persisted across a wide variety of cities and towns and project types. So big developments, small developments, affordable housing and market rate, big cities and small cities. And so one of the things that my colleagues at BU and I were really interested in understanding was sort of how those dynamics are continuing to manifest. And so we have 3 ongoing projects, and I'm going to present sort of snippets from each of these today to allow us a lot of time for a really great conversation. But we studied participation in local politics in the Zoom era. We studied different form of anti-housing mobilization, so not just public meetings, the case of Framingham's apartment ban. And we also are thinking a little bit about the role of developers in housing politics, and specifically how deep dislike and distrust of developers may be fueling opposition to housing in many communities, and sort of what we can do to change this and to potentially build some trust. So I want to start with our research on participation in Zoom meetings. So in March 2020, our world in so many different ways changed. And as folks in the room know, from one of the ways that it changed for local politics was that everything that used to happen in person shifted over to Zoom. And so we moved our housing meetings, those planning and zoning board meetings that we studied from 2015 to 2017, moved from being in city halls and senior centers to being online. And we wanted to understand whether that shift to moving online changed the composition of participants and changed what they said. And we had real reason for optimism. We were sort of hoping to be able to tell like a really positive story about how this shift ultimately ended up being an equalizing force in housing politics. It's a lot easier to log into a Zoom room than to get over to City Hall or to a senior center. It requires way less time. You don't always have to secure childcare. You can be like doing the dishes at home with your headphones in while listening to a developer presentation, right? Like there's a lot of reasons to suspect that making it easier to participate might have made the participants themselves more representative of the broader community. So between March and September 2020, David Glick, Louisa Godinez-Puig, and Max Palmer and I went out and documented who was participating in these meetings. And so across 76 cities and towns in Massachusetts that made their meeting minutes available, we documented 798 commenters who made over 1,000 comments about housing developments in this period. And we focused not just on sort of big housing developments, but as in our previous research, we also looked at smaller infill developments and townhouse proposals. So again, these data, like our data from 2015 and 2017, think about big and small projects. And what we found was really striking to us because it's almost exactly the same as the disparities that we found in our in-person data. So we find there's a slight bias towards men in our data, that men are somewhat more likely to participate. Democrats are very slightly more likely to participate. But the big disparities in favor of white people over the age of 50, and homeowners still persist. And we were especially sort of really struck by that bias in favor of folks over the age of 50, because one of the critiques, rightfully so, based on what we know about digital literacy and digital access, is that these Zoom meetings may have proved to be really challenging for some of our seniors to navigate. And it turns out, at least for the sort of broadly defined over 50 set, that this does not seem to be the case. As with in-person meetings, Zoom meetings appear to be biased in favor of older people, white people, and homeowners. And what's more, these meetings still are overwhelmingly attracting opponents to the construction of new housing. So only 13% of commenters to these online Zoom forums support the construction of new housing, while 61% oppose the construction of new housing. And again, those numbers are remarkably similar to what we saw in the in-person era. And so again, this doesn't mean that for any individual city or town or meeting, we might not be seeing some new voices show up. But when we take the sort of data as a whole, and when we look across cities and towns in Massachusetts sort of in concert, it suggests that Zoom may not have really transformed the dynamic of our public meetings. And right now we're really trying to brainstorm, and I'm eager to hear sort of what folks in the room, what their experience has been. But a couple of possible explanations is that, one, the same factors that make it easier for supporters of new housing to participate also work for housing opponents. So just because we made it easier to participate does not necessarily mean that we created forums that are going to be more welcoming or attractive to people who support the construction of new housing. And relatedly, reducing participation costs does not necessarily increase interest in participating, especially among those who maybe weakly prefer new housing, but aren't especially passionate about these issues, right? That yes, it is easier to attend a 3-hour Zoom meeting about housing than it is to attend a 3-hour in-person meeting, but it is still a 3-hour meeting, right? And so there are still some of these barriers to sort of becoming interested in participating in this process that may persist, even if Zoom itself makes it easier for folks to participate. All right, so that's our research on Zoom era. It wasn't, as optimistic as we'd like. And I want to spend time thinking about a different case of housing participation in 2020. And this is the Framingham apartment moratorium. And this is some collaborative work with my colleague, Max Palmer, and an undergrad at Boston University named Bong Tran. And this project grew out of an incredible effort from the Initiative on Cities and the city of Framingham. So this is our Metro Bridge program, where we actually partner partner undergraduate classes at Boston University with interested local government partners to tackle sort of an issue that local governments have proposed. And in this case, Framingham, under the leadership of Mayor Spicer, proposed analyzing racial equity in political representation in Framingham from a variety of different perspectives. And I actually want to pause to say what a privilege it is to get to be on a panel with Mayor Spicer and with a mayor that genuinely believes that taking a critical look at racial equity in town processes and in city processes is a really important thing to do. Not all mayors are sort of willing to open up their cities to being criticized along racial equity lines. And so it was really exciting to have this partnership and this opportunity to work with the city of Framingham to genuinely analyze racial equity. And so my class did this from a variety of different perspectives, but the project that I want to focus on for today was explicitly centered around Framingham's apartment moratorium. So in 2020, a citizen petition came before the city council in Framingham and ultimately led to the city council supporting an apartment moratorium and banning the construction of multifamily housing for 9 months. And so one of the things we were really interested, because this came before the city council as a consequence of a citizen petition, my students and our research team were really interested in understanding who are the folks who were part of this very impactful citizen petition. And so we were able to match the people who participated in this petition with the Framingham voter file to learn a bit about who these folks were. And so we were able to match 183 of the signatories of this petition to better understand their demographics. And we found, again, sort of really striking disparities that are not so different from the ones that we find in our public meetings. So we find that the petitioners are 80% white compared to 62% of voters. We find that they're 72% homeowner compared with 54% of voters. And I want to pause here to stress that our comparison group here is voters, right? This isn't the general public. We are comparing petitioners to voters, right? And voters are already a somewhat privileged set of the population, right? So again, this is in some ways suggesting smaller differences than what we would probably find if we compared with the general public. We also found that the folks who are participating in this petition were owners of higher value properties. So the average property value of a homeowning petitioner was $460,000, compared with the median housing value in Framingham of $384,000. We also find that they are quite geographically clustered. So these are not individuals who represent the incredible diversity of neighborhoods in Framingham. 1/3 of all the petitioners came from just 3 precincts. 50% were from 5 precincts. 6 precincts had less than 5 petitioners each. And so I find this to be a really troubling and informative illustration of the way that these participatory disparities can have a profound impact on the housing supply in communities that may need to be increasing their housing based on sort of what we're learning now about the housing shortage in Greater Boston. So finally, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about developers and housing politics. And this is work that I'm doing with David Glick and Max Palmer. We're really thinking a lot about how developers may be shaping opposition to the construction of new housing. And in many ways, this is something, as we've thought about it and as we've observed, we wish we'd spent more time on in our book, because it is becoming increasingly apparent from public opinion survey, just from attending meetings, that there is deep-seated opposition to developers. There's deep-seated mistrust of developers. And this perception of developers as being profit-seeking and greedy may be creating opposition to new housing, and also maybe making it harder to sort of reform housing, both at the local level and at the state level. And I want to stress that this is rooted, right, in a history of developer power at the local level that has all too often come at the expense of communities of color in particular, but more broadly, marginalized community concerns and interests. Developers have a really ugly history in many cities of reshaping those communities for their financial interests and not the interests of the broader community. So there's really good historical reasons for this distrust to exist, right? But It is profound. The sort of distrust of developers is incredible. And one of the piece of evidence I want to show you, just to suggest that this is a really important factor that we need to be taking seriously if we want to find a path to building more housing. So this is an analysis that we did of survey data from two political scientists named Will Marble and Clayton Nall. And what they did is they did a survey across 20 large cities in the United States. And they asked about all sorts of housing related things. But one of the really interesting questions they asked was just a basic trust question, like how much do you trust a variety of different entities? And so they asked about homeowners, the police, renters, local government, President Trump, and real estate developers. And people just hate real estate developers in these big cities, which obviously skew pretty Democratic. Real estate developers are almost as unpopular as President Trump and corporate executives. In contrast, over 90% of people in these cities trust homeowners, right? And so when we start to think about how our housing politics gets made, what kinds of conversations we have about zoning reform and land use reform and housing policy more generally, it's maybe not surprising when we look at this public opinion that a lot of the policies that we're seeing getting promulgated in many communities really favor the interests of homeowners. We also started to do an analysis of the behavior of developers at some in-person public meetings to try to better understand sort of how developers present themselves. And one of the things that was really striking to us as we analyzed these meeting minutes is that while neighbors tend to raise really broad community-oriented concerns, which led us to label them as neighborhood defenders in our book, developers often stick really narrowly to presenting projects and discussions of local land use codes. So they very seldomly, and they do it a little more often in some big cities, but they, as a rule, particularly in smaller communities, don't spend a lot of time linking their development plans with broader city and town goals or neighborhood concerns. It may be that developers are better at organizing in some other forums, right? So we're analyzing right now sort of how often developers participate, potentially with other natural allies like trade unions or construction groups, and things like city level rezonings. But we also found in our analysis of campaign records that they are not particularly massive campaign donors compared with other organized interests. And depending upon how you classify them, they comprise between 5 and 12% of campaign donations in local elections in the biggest cities in Massachusetts, or I should say the cities in Massachusetts that have the most expensive local elections. So Boston, Cambridge, Fall River, Lawrence, Lynn, New Bedford, Newton, Quincy, Somerville, and Worcester. So just in conclusion, these are obviously sort of broad and maybe seemingly disparate kinds of projects that are unified around this theme of creating more equitable housing processes and making it more possible to build housing. And so just as a few quick takeaways, Zoom has not solved participatory disparities. Disparities look pretty much the same in the Zoom era as they did before Zoom. We also find that concerning biases towards white people and homeowners persist across a variety of contexts. So it's not just these public hearings, it's also things like petitions. And that has an important impact on the production of new housing. And finally, we posit that a major challenge to housing reform and the approval of new projects is the deep unpopularity of developers. And that's going to be something that I think a lot of pro-housing groups are going to have to really think carefully about how to manage that unpopularity and address that serious concern. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to hearing comments from Whitney, from Mayor Spicer, and from everyone else who's attending this panel. So thank you.
Oh my, I'm sitting here like a student that I am as you present there, Dr. Einstein. I know I can see all of the questions and many questions rolling in as it relates to a lot of what you've discussed. And so I will continue our conversation now with some prepared questions, but certainly want to encourage folks to, in the chat and the Q&A, to submit your questions so that we have time to get to those as it relates to the presentation. I want to just jump right in. And so feel free, Dr. Einstein and Dr. Mayor Spicer, to unmute yourselves and let's engage here in a conversation. As we know, right, housing is the way to move towards a more equitable society, right? And April, of course, is Fair Housing Month. I constantly bring that lens to the work in whatever spaces that I'm in, right? And April being a time to really commemorate, to honor, to acknowledge the need to continue to center fair housing practices and policies, right? And in the past few years, we've really seen under the former federal administration a direct attack, a rollback, a rescinding, really, of key fair housing protections. In what ways can municipal leaders prepare to combat discrimination in housing? And how has fair housing concerns shown up in Framingham? I was hoping you may start, Mayor Spicer.
Thank you, Whitney, and Dr. Einstein. Thank you for that setup and also summary of the research that was done. And it's important to use the data to inform decisions, and then to inform decisions that are inclusive. My city of Framingham prides itself on its diversity. And if you ask the average person what they love most about this community, they will say it's diversity. So we have to be very deliberate in celebrating that diversity. And that's one of the things, since I've been mayor, I've made a concerted effort to do so, whether it is looking at things in multiple languages, trying to engage with the community in culturally appropriate ways, actually going to the community, going to the churches, going right to the community centers on a Sunday afternoon in our Brazilian community. So these are some of the things that I've seen hinder people, especially when you think about fair housing. This past year with the pandemic has also really taken its toll on families, and realizing how fragile we are as it relates to housing, as it relates to communities of color, and also inequities around it. There's housing inequity, but oftentimes one inequity leads to another: food insecurity, as well as health inequities. All of these are tied together. So I've been tackling them all together and really trying to think about ways in which Framingham as a community are having those critical conversations about ways in which we do things, and the ways and why we do them. So I feel that this is a conversation that I am engaging the professionals in my city who work on housing. I'm also looking to the state and federal government to look at some of those ideas and ways in which we can move the needle. And some of the legislation that has been passed already, but it's still, as we see, not enough, because we're still in a place of a lack of participation of communities that are most affected by affordable housing, having access to affordable housing, and trying to continue the dialogue and making sure that we are engaging as many people as we can in our community. So I've done that consistently, and part of the challenge is really making sure people understand the value added. If everyone can coexist in our community, whether you are at the upper echelon of being able to afford a $1,000 house, and we have $1 million homes and homeless shelters in my city. So really trying to find that medium where people not just looking at this is a situation of, well, too bad they can't, we just don't have it here. We have to create it. We have to create mechanisms for people to live and want to be in a community. And there are days where, as the mayor of this city, it feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes 3 steps back. And you just have to keep at it. And that's educating, informing, let the data inform decisions, and making sure that we are using the data appropriately.
Love that. I love that approach. You talk about sort of celebrating the diversity, but also thinking about ways to sustain that sense of diversity as well, and making sure that everyone is part of those solutions, right, to really get us there. I want to jump into a question about the findings, right, in this report that you put together, Dr. Einstein. The data findings from your report showed that supporters of the recent development moratorium in Framingham were not representative of the larger population, right? So something that we sort of knew to be true, but you dared to do the work, right? You dared to take the time and inclination. And also, as you mentioned, Framingham, and by the leadership of the mayor, have taken that initiative to partner with you all in doing that sort of work. And I want to commend you both on those efforts. It's really, truly amazing. And I think, as you said, it's something that we'd love to see more municipalities sort of really actively taking on. It mentioned in your research that petitioners were 80% white compared to 62% of voters in the area. How can we promote inclusive engagement that brings more voices to the fold and elevates diverse perspectives? I'd love for both of you to answer that, but I'll start with you, Dr. Einstein.
Sure. So I think one of the actually just amazing things, one example that I'll provide is just from Mayor Spicer's continued relationship with Boston University. So in the fall, her office partnered with my class to, invited us to analyze racial equity. And so we did this with the apartment ban. She also, their team invited us to look at their boards and commissions and actually sort of document deep racial inequities there as well. And so now this semester, they are actually partnering with some Portuguese classes at Boston University to really think about how to reach out to Portuguese speaking people in Framingham who may have felt left out simply because things were not available in sort of their first language, right? And so that's maybe a small example of what we can do, but to sort of generalize that to a broader point, I think it's really important to make it so that people are interested in the politics and feel like their voices matter in the proceedings. That all too often in politics in a variety of settings, we send signals intentionally and unintentionally that people's voices are not welcome in those forums, that they don't matter. And when people don't have a sense of efficacy, they don't participate, they don't trust the proceedings. And so I think thinking of ways big and small that we can signal to those voices that they matter in these proceedings, that they should care about them, it's huge. Easier said than done, but I think that's sort of the root of what we as people who care about these issues need to engage with.
Absolutely. And I will piggyback and say that when you bring the conversation directly to the people, that is also critically important. And so when we start to think about decisions that are impacting particularly our communities of color, our linguistically diverse community, we want to make sure that things are presented to them in multiple languages. Also, that it actually comes to them in an appropriate time. For example, we know that a number of our parts of our community, a good percentage of our Brazilian community, if you host something on a Sunday afternoon, participation is large versus something at 7 o'clock when people are having to put their children down for sleep or getting dinner ready. Those are culturally incompatible times to have meetings about some critical conversations like housing, like the need for new housing. The other thing that, once again, I come back to this pandemic, and what it has taught us, particularly about housing security. We have been able to provide resources for families, whether it's helping with utilities or rent, but we're also noticing too that as a result of the pandemic, people have lost their housing and they're doubling up and tripling up in some cases with families in housing situations that are just not conducive for that many people. So it's really, it's time to take the blinders off, so to speak, and acknowledge that there is, in fact, a challenge in communities. And the only way we're going to solve parts of these challenges, if you're out of work and you're out of a house, it really impacts what you can do in terms of making a living for yourself and your family. So you have to get at the root causes of some of these issues. And, housing is critical. Housing is absolutely critical for people to maintain a job, to be able to, you have to have an address to be able to do just about anything. And so really, I've made a point of really being very deliberate about putting in an eviction moratorium during this pandemic. And I signed that in February to really counter the potential of people not having housing, and to really try to say, let's work through this together and trying to figure out ways that people can survive and sustain themselves within the community. So once again, being very deliberate and unapologetic about it too. It's it is a public health crisis for not to have a home. It truly is a crisis.
Thank you for those comments. I think you all are spot on in terms of really understanding the boldness and the activeness that it takes to really do this work well, and to have some sort of central cultural competency as well as you go into communities to make those connections, to think about what's the timeliness of the meetings we're having, and how do we engage folks and meet them where they are. To that end, the next question I'd love to ask is, how can then public engagement reflect the diversity of the community at large? You talked a little bit about, what we can be doing to have translation services, to be more timely about when we're having our meetings, and to help folks to make those connections, as you said, Mayor Spicer, between it being a housing crisis and their actual on the ground issues of being overcrowded, et cetera. But really, how can we make it more reflective? What are some additional things that we can be using, tools, et cetera?
It's interesting when it came to boards and commissions and getting a more diverse group of people participating in boards and commissions. We hosted a number of informational webinars for folks, but we've also kind of rallied other people of color, and especially people of color and underserved and underrepresented, to find a friend, come and join a meeting and just come and learn what's happening in the proceedings with a friend. The other thing that I'm pretty proud of is that we have the most diverse boards and commissions than we ever had in the history of Framingham. And there's still plenty of work to do. Make no mistake about it, because there are parts of our community where participation is extremely low. So once again, it's what I've learned, especially during this pandemic. You have to bring the information directly to the trusted community leaders, which are the churches, which are the pastors, which are the people that are community organizers, and working closely with them to bring information. And so, when I am traveling throughout our city, I am very intentional about my appearance in the parts of Framingham that are often underserved, and people see and know that their mayor is available and say, oh my goodness, it's the mayor. She has come to our neighborhood. She's come to speak to us. And so those are the things that I do on a regular basis. And there are some rules and regulations around formal meetings starting at 7 o'clock, but it's something that we need to really examine and think about boards and commissions hosting their meetings, not necessarily as we move towards out of COVID, but not just necessarily being here in City Hall, but going right to the neighborhoods, hosting meetings in the neighborhoods. And I think that becomes critically important, especially when it's around housing and projects that are impacting our community. And so it's work, but it's also well worth it, and it's consistent work. It is something that has to be done consistently.
Great point. And it's certainly work, right? It takes this extra energy and effort, but it's work that's needed and necessary. Dr. Einstein, I don't know if there's anything you want to add. I know you've looked at many communities and in terms of what they're doing and maybe what they're doing well. Are there other components that you can think about that we should be doing in our work as well?
Yes, I think Mayor Spicer is absolutely right that, changing the location and so the way that we get community input, right? So, I think taking meetings to neighborhoods could potentially be beneficial, and even thinking about ways to maybe get more information from someone who's walking by a billboard and, looks at a QR code, right? And fills in information that way. I mean, really figuring out ways to reach out to people who don't want to attend 3-hour meetings. But more generally, I've advocated for this before, but I think it's really important. We need to think strategically about what we're holding community meetings over, because there are times where that input is so important, so valuable, But there are also times where it is almost inconceivable that what we're holding a meeting over will ever attract a representative subset of the population. And so I actually served on the redevelopment board in my town during the pandemic. And, we hear hearings over things like 4-unit apartment buildings. And I can't imagine if I, led a pro-housing organization in my community flooding this 3-hour meeting over 4 units of housing to try to combat neighborhood opponents. And so I think we need to maybe be more strategic about sort of what are the kinds of things for which we seek neighborhood input, and what are decisions that maybe don't require these kinds of public meetings, because we know the only people who will show up will be deeply opposed to those developments. And so I think that that's something that, local officials, I know so many of them, when we talk to them, have really grappled with this. Like, when is it helpful to have a public meeting, and when is it just something that's only going to attract a few very vocal opponents of housing or anything else?
That's a great, interesting perspective about how do we reframe and rethink how we're doing this work as well. So I want to switch our question a bit to talk a little bit more. I'll direct this question to you, Mayor Spicer. How do you envision the current development moratorium affecting the future of Framingham, and how do you plan to engage local leaders, et cetera, in a positive framing of the housing issues facing your area and Greater Boston at large? And I've heard you allude to it as sort of the Scarlet M, right, with sort of lasting effects, right, for years to come. And then, there's this looming issue of the 1972 moratorium that was supposed to be temporary, but that still has some standing, lasting effects. And so I guess the question really is, how do we plan to engage local leaders in a positive framing of the housing issues as you move forward?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost is looking at some of the rationale of the apartment moratorium, housing multi-unit moratorium of units greater than 4. Is that we had a influx of new housing, particularly in our downtown, over the last couple of years with the rezoning of the downtown area, central business zoning, having transit-oriented development that is literally blocks away from the train station, and we have a couple of developments that are, I'm proud to say, that are built. And one particular development is currently 90% occupied. So that is telling me that when you look at some of the housing, this is the first new housing in downtown Framingham in over 40 years. It is working. It's attracting people, and the fears and the concerns around adding to the burden of increasing enrollment in schools and so forth. These were some of the concerns that were raised during these issues. But we also had the conversation with our business community that says, wait a minute, I'm trying to expand in Framingham. I need places where my future employees can live. So it's trying to find that delicate balance between gradually opening up some housing, but also looking at the added value, the return on the investment. And that's one of the things that I think is going to be critically important to discuss with other leaders in my community, my leaders on city council, leaders in the community, our business leaders, is that how do we want to see Framingham recover and reimagine itself through this pandemic as we climb out? And it's really about housing, economic recovery, and that equals economic growth, and also a balance of taxes. And when you start to think about having new businesses in the community, that impacts its tax rate. So having that kind of conversation and really leading to a place that it is also by having this moratorium precludes Framingham from being able to access some state aid and some state programs, which we have previously been able to be a part of. And I'm deeply concerned about that as we start to see the light at the end of this pandemic and wanting to recover. I want to make sure my city is poised to receive all other the resources that are going to help us move forward as a community, a very diverse community, and putting limitations of any kind, I really puts us at a disadvantage. And so I'm really hoping we can work through this with our city council, and working collaborative to say where's the happy medium, where is the it's not an either or, it's where do we find the common center. And I'm looking forward to working on that, as I pride myself on as being a person being a problem solver, and I want to solve this problem, but I also want to see my city thrive, and I may be a little biased in that I think Framingham is the best city in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I want to see us do well and continue to grow as a community.
I love that strategy of really, I think you constantly bring that lens in terms of thinking about who the leaders are, who the stakeholders are, sort of breaking that down, right? Religious leaders, business leaders, bringing everyone into the fold to kind of like you said, find those solutions to really benefit the city, right? And those impacts. So we are currently in this pandemic, right? And the digital public engagement has really been the core of our communicating and connecting with residents really since the pandemic. So with our need to stay home and practice social distancing, public meetings and forums have moved right online. Do we envision this trend continuing beyond the pandemic? And will this last really beyond the moment? What other digital tools then also can we use to engage residents in these public processes? Because I know, Dr. Einstein, you mentioned in your research, like, despite what we were hoping to see with all of this, it didn't necessarily change all of the trends in terms of being older, whiter homeowners participating in the space. I wonder if you might be able to weigh in there first, Dr. Einstein.
Yeah, of course. So, it's interesting when I've talked about some of our depressing Zoom findings, and I really was hoping we'd be able to present something more like optimistic and hopeful, because we always bring such like depressing participatory inequalities to light. But one of the things I've talked to, particularly with some organizers who are in bigger cities, both in the East Coast and in California, what they've said is, they have seen some meetings that have just been flooded with sort of pro-housing perspectives that have been very different than ones that you've seen in person. And so it's one of the reasons that I sort of suggest that our data show us in the aggregate things haven't really changed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in individual places and contexts, we aren't starting to see the emergence of some potentially effective organizing strategies. And so one thing that I would love, if I had an amazing national database and more time to really get a sense of, and maybe it's just a question of interviewing folks and getting a sense of what's happening in other places, I do wonder whether these online forums can intersect with organizing in interesting ways, that in places where community organizers are really able to mobilize sort of a pro-housing group, it's a lot easier to get that pro-housing group to show up if all they have to do is follow a Zoom link than drag themselves over to City Hall or Town Hall, right? And so I think what our data show us is that in the absence of organizing, just making it easier to participate is not going to solve the problem of participatory inequality in our housing forums, but that perhaps with deliberate organizing, with deliberate outreach to trusted community leaders, maybe online meetings can potentially make it easier to get representation. But again, I think the other place where I look for equitable participation is to move us to some extent beyond just thinking about meetings. Are there other ways that we can get citizen input and still be inclusive and not just ignore sort of what our constituents want without necessarily reifying an in-person meeting where like 8 people show up and can influence how much housing gets built? I think moving beyond that forum is going to be really important if we want to produce enough housing to meet the demand in our communities.
I love that. More innovative ways for participation other than attending the meetings. We have to work on getting you that funding so you can do that national work. Mayor Spicer, is there anything you can add there in terms of what you are doing in Framingham, how you see beyond this moment, digital work being, and even the digital divide that I think also probably plays a role in the differences of people engaging?
once again, it truly is, and thank you, Dr. Einstein, for that comment, because it really is important to realize that access is so critically important, and everyone doesn't have equitable access to technology to allow us to participate in the Zoom, nor are necessarily the technologies caught up in a way that, there's closed caption, there's somebody translating in your language, maybe the meeting is held in your language. These are things that I've learned over the last particularly few months of trying to get vaccines to people and getting vaccines in people's arms. We have community forums in their native language, in Spanish, in English, in Portuguese, and that's intentional to say, oh, this is for me. You're doing this, so I understand, so I can participate in this. And so more of that needs to happen when it comes to issues around housing. And you're absolutely right that it's not always about participating in the discussion or having the conversation. It's really trying to look to the needs. What are your needs? And getting real good data about what the needs are, as opposed to what we think they should be. And so those are the kinds of places that I feel there's so much room for improvement. And we just have to be very deliberate about it.
That's great. I think you're right. People feel that sense of authentic outreach, targeted, and it's felt, and it certainly can be reflected in results. I want to pause a bit because I want to allow for some time for questions. I know I had some other questions planned for you guys, and this conversation is really, really going so well. But I want to allow the last 10 minutes of our time to really jump into some of the questions folks are sending to me in the chat and the Q&A. So this is exciting. The first question I think we had during registration that was sent over is sort of this more optimistic thinking, right? If you could have one housing policy passed this year on the state level, what would it be? Who wants to start there? So optimistic, right? I think also now in this, particularly in this moment that we're in, and the administration, we have a strong sort of HUD secretary, and so much going on. Of course, I'm sitting in the moment of Fair Housing Month, right? And thinking about that. But certainly, there may be something you're thinking about, and take some time. We can even jump back to that question if you'd like, Dr. Einstein.
I think what I want is like a full package, because, a lot of people, in my own research, right, is very focused on land use reform. But I think anyone who studies this acknowledges that land use reform is a really important first step. It's necessary, but it cannot be the only step. So if we're doing like my pie in the sky dream policy, not one that is likely to get passed in the Commonwealth anytime soon, it would be one that involves the abolition of single family zoning, but alongside incentivizing affordable housing development, providing perhaps density bonuses for folks who provide more affordable housing, serious protections from evictions, and serious funding so that we can actually build the subsidized housing that we need, because we need market rate housing and we need subsidized housing. So I favor a housing package that gets us both types of housing that we need. So if we're going optimistic, I'll just go.
I love that.
Really optimistic.
Package. Yes.
And I will add to that, because once again, it's the notion of trying to make sure it's inclusive, because that's where you run into a lot of challenges where the cost of housing, what may be considered affordable for one community, is totally not affordable for another, and so when you start to think about how do we make this an environment that we are deliberate in attracting a diverse group of people living in this space? And whether it's a multi-unit housing, those are the things, whether housing for veterans, housing for people with disabilities, making sure that it's culturally and ethically inclusive of the community. There's a balance within in the housing that reflects your community. So that goes along with making it affordable, and also thinking about ways that people are living today. And I think that's one of the things too that we have to remember. During this pandemic, people have been living very differently. People are working from home. How do we make that environment more conducive to that? And creating community within these spaces, because that's the other part of this. Is I've seen the movement away, as you look at single family homes, you don't have that sense of community that you tend to have in closer quarters with each other. And I think there's something to be said about building community again across this country in a way that makes good sense, that we are looking at each other as my brother and my sister's keeper, and having and the rich diversity of my community is also influencing and impacting the quality of my life in a positive way.
Ooh, that gives me the feels. I love that. I really do. Okay, I'm going to jump into the next question we got from Adam here in the chat. Have you thought about comparing participation before and after hyper pro-housing advocacy groups are created? Could there be evidence that a clearinghouse for pro-housing improves the turnout at local meetings? So I guess the impact before and after of a pro-housing advocacy group sort of starting in a community.
Yes, I mean, I think that's definitely a really promising direction for sort of future research. And one of the things that David, Max, and I are actually working on is we've been collecting local level ordinances around the abolition actually of single family zoning, which has been happening in more and more cities across the country, focused on sort of the production of more missing middle housing. And one of the things that sort of the long-term goal, once we have this database, is to really look to see how different types of organizing strategies and campaign strategies may be shaping the passage and proposal of those kinds of policies. I also know of other folks and other researchers who are doing really cool field experiments where they're trying to assess whether different organizing strategies may be more effective for mobilizing folks. So I feel like that was like the most typical academic answer ever, which is like, we and others are doing research on it, but we don't know. So that's my answer. So hopefully this time next year, someone will have an answer for you, either me and my colleagues or some other amazing researchers out there.
Oh no, that sounds great. I mean, honestly, as we're asking that question, I'm like, oh my goodness, part of what we do at CHAPA is sort of start these pro-housing coalitions. I love to see what a before and after might be in Framingham. Maybe the three of us put our heads together and just sort of thinking out loud, right, in terms of that question. Oh, that's excellent. So we have another question from Eugene. Is there any research showing a correlation between the demographic area incomes, inequality, and anti-housing outcomes? Is there any research showing a correlation between the demographic area's income inequality and anti-housing outcomes?
Yeah. So one of the really, I think, important takeaways from our research is this pattern happens everywhere, and it persists across very different types of communities, rich communities, poor communities, unequal communities, more homogenous communities, racially segregated communities, communities that don't have as much racial segregation. And it's actually one of the things that has led us to think a little bit more about people's relationships and attitudes towards developers, because trying to understand what is like the common thread that sort of connects people across these very disparate types of places facing very different types of development pressure. And so our conversation here today is primarily about Massachusetts. That's where we all live. It's where we're all very politically active. But this is something that happens across the country, and in places that have really hot housing markets and places that don't have really hot housing markets. People don't like new housing being built near them, and that's sort of apparently a general human truth. It's really hard to find places where we see sort of lots of people show up to public meetings in support of the construction of new housing. So yeah, that's sort of the big takeaway, is that this happens in an incredible diversity of places. It's a unifying thread of local government.
Much to do, right? It leaves us with this sense of really there is much to do. Another question that has come in is relates to local preference. As to policy, I wonder, this question is from David, I wonder about 70% local preference that the state allows local governments in 40B context, which excludes many otherwise eligible applicants, especially those of color seeking to find housing in high opportunity communities. I know Brookline has reduced its local preference threshold to 25% to mitigate these discriminatory impacts. Any comments from either of you around that question? I guess it's sort of made a comment there, but any comments you have around local preference and what that means to allow for more people of color seeking housing in communities, which will then hopefully lead to not only more participation in those processes, but also a diversity.
I'll just say, I think in the town I live in Arlington, it's a conversation I've had with folks. I think it's a huge problem for suburbs to have local preference for their public housing. And I'm so sympathetic to why that is the case. We see, in particular, in a lot of the suburbs, it's senior citizens. So we see a lot of our senior citizen residents really hurting and needing this support. And so I'm sympathetic to it. But the reality is, when we look at racial segregation in the greater Boston area, if our wealthy inner core suburbs are providing local preferences for their subsidized housing, it means it will disproportionately go to white people. And so, yeah, I think that's something that really needs a critical reassessment.
Mm-hmm. And here, there's a little more diversity here in Framingham, but once again, it's still something that needs to be examined and being deliberate. You're being extremely deliberate, even, with some of our new housing, 10% has to be affordable, but that's the only caveat. So it's not it has really anything to do with demographics of our community. And I once again think that can be examined a little bit closer, and making sure that it is reflective of the community and as it diversifies. That's, and you raised an interesting point. A number of our suburban communities west of Boston are not so diverse at all. And I said, even here in Framingham, we are a very diverse community, but, in terms of racial breakdown, there's probably about 5% African-American that live in Framingham. So, that's of a city of 75,000 people. So that, you start to look at that and say, well, how does that measure out for people to be reflective in the housing market? So it is a challenge.
Oh my goodness, this has been an excellent conversation that I have been anticipating for some time, but it has gone by quickly. We are actually at time, and thank you for those who have stuck with us. We're just a few minutes over, but I want to thank Abundant Housing for having me here, and certainly Dr. Mayor Spicer and Dr. Einstein. This has been a great conversation, and excited for us to even be putting our heads together around some continued work. I love to be able to turn it over now to Abundant Housing's Executive Director, Jesse Canton.
Thank you, Whitney. My name is Jesse Canton-Bennett, and I am the incoming Executive Director, the first Executive Director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. And so I'm really honored that we were able to co-host this event with the BU Initiative on Cities. Thank you, Mayor Spicer, for taking the time to join us, Dr. Einstein for sharing your research, and Whitney for doing such a fantastic job of moderating this discussion and posing some incredibly thoughtful questions. Bea laid out at the beginning a little bit about who we are as Abundant Housing, what we believe in. I want to make a pitch to all the participants that remain to join us. We are a membership-based organization. We are about to launch our formal membership drive. Our goal is to try to address some of these very complex questions around how do we increase engagement, the diversity of engagement, who participates in these conversations, and in order to help build a powerful and effective pro-housing movement across the state of Massachusetts. So I think we're going to throw in a link again to our website where folks can join as Abundant Housing Massachusetts inaugural members and help us as we work, with Mayor Spicer and other elected officials around the state to try to build more diverse, inclusive communities across the state. So just want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the participants, and thank you to the BU Initiative on Cities for co-hosting this with us. I hope everyone has a fantastic